brother Thomas Fund. She teaches writing at Brown University. Thank you, Grace, for being here and facilitating tonight's discussion. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Patricia Engel to our stage. Patricia is the author of Infinite Country, a New York Times bestseller and Reese's Book Club selection. Her other titles have won the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the International Latino Book Award, and the Premio Biblioteca de Narrativa Colombiana and International Latino Book Award, and have been finalists for the Penn, Hemingway, and Young Lions Fiction Awards, and the New York Times Notable Book. Born to Colombian parents and herself a dual citizen, Patricia is an associate professor of creative writing at the University of Miami. Infinite Country was the first of Patricia's books that I encountered, a slim novel that did not need a single page more to be one of the most powerful books I've read in the last decade. Her voice was quietly confident, weaving a steady tapestry of decades of continents of loneliness and love. This book had such a knack for capturing the beauty and the ugliness of nations. It had such a deft and gracious touch with its characters, the split selves of a family missing each other by yards and by years. There was strength and kindness at this book's core. When I saw that Patricia had a new collection coming, I was overjoyed. What a privilege it is to be dropped for a few pages at a time into the lives of new characters written by Patricia Engel, into their fresh struggles and honed language and intricate family dynamics, into the sights and smells of their cities, into their hopes and their pettiness and their perfection and the staggering looming threat of loss that accompanies being alive. It's a beautiful collection, and I am very happy to have her here to speak with us on it today. So please welcome Patricia Engel.
Thank you so much. Hello? Okay, thank you so much. It's my first time here in this beautiful store. Wow, you're so lucky. You're so lucky you have a place like this. There's so many communities that don't have bookstores, independent booksellers, and this place is really spectacular. So thank you so much for having me here. And thank you, Alex, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Grace, for joining me here. Grace and I met many years ago here in Boston, and I'm so happy that we could be together again.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking me. So we were thinking we would have a conversation for the first 30 minutes or so, and then Patricia, you'd read, and then we'd open up to the audience.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. So, so this is your 5th published book.
Are you on?
Oh,
Can you? Oh, there it is.
okay. Oh, thank you. All right, you can all hear. Okay. So this is your 5th published book. I think every single one of your books has been notable, award-winning in some way. And I was curious about your experience and process in writing new work. You know, there's this, do you feel this pressure externally when you get back to the page to do the work, the solitary work of writing?
I think the solitary work of writing is what I love most about it. It's why I think all of us writers started out writing, because of that, the simple joy of writing alone, writing for yourself. So that's what I look most forward to when I finish a book and it's time to write another one. Of course, the blank page can be a little scary at times, but that's also the fun of it. But in the case of the Faraway World, this is a combination of both old and new work, because these are 10 short stories that were written over the last 10 or 12 years. And so a lot of them are stories that have been with me for a very, very long time, that were around even before online novels, right? So it's a collection that came together slowly, and in a way it kind of tells the story of my life, and certainly my writing life over the last decade or so. So this book, it came together in parts and in pauses, and somehow the stories are all in conversation with one another. But in that way, it has a much wider scope than perhaps my other books that were written, you know, in sustained, enclosed periods of time.
Right. Well, maybe we could talk about the first story in the collection, Aida. And I know folks, the story was published elsewhere, but maybe you haven't read it yet, so I won't give it away any spoilers or anything while I talk about the stories. So for that story, I was really interested in your choice. So the scenario for Aida is They're twins, sisters, and one of them goes missing. And so we hear what happens from the perspective of the twin sister who's not missing. And so I'm curious about the choice to tell it from her perspective. You could find a few different perspectives to tell that kind of experience from. And what did you find as why were you drawn to that voice?
Yeah, that story, Aida, came to me from a few different, points of origin. And I thought about it for a long time before I sat down to write about it. The furthest back would be the fact that I have no sisters. And that's something that has always fascinated me. People who have sisters, what is that like? I have an older brother, and I always wished he was an older sister. So I've always had a little bit of that fascination with the relationship of sisters. Even more so with the relationship of twins, because I do have twins in my family, and I know a lot of people who are twins, and that's an even more specific kind of bond, right? So I thought, well, I want to explore this somehow. And separately, I was watching a true crime show once, and it was about the disappearance of a teenage girl. And, as they do in those shows, sometimes they interview the family members who talk about what happened and how terrible it was. And I remember being very impacted by the expressions on the faces of the family members who never knew what happened to their daughter and had to live with that unknowing. And I thought about what that does to a family, what the weight of unknowing does to a family. And I started to think about family systems, and sometimes family systems are very complicated, and sometimes some families are really just held together by the efforts of one member of that family unit or by the children. So you learn very quickly in the story, Aida, that these twin sisters, really believe that they're responsible for keeping their parents' marriage together. That happens, right? People stay together often for the kids. And then what happens when one of those girls goes missing? What does it do to the sister who remains? What does it do to the family as a whole? So it's less about really the facts of her disappearance and abduction, and more about the aftermath.
Yes, and that story is incredibly dramatic and has a lot of momentum, and yet it's also really moving at this too. It has all of those together. And for me, what was particularly moving about it was the twin. I mean, she looks like her sister, so people are looking for this missing sister, and they think it's her. And my husband is an identical twin, and he's very close with his brother, and they'll talk about that twin kind of bond and connection of someone feels something intense and the other one calls them because they know that the other one's upset. And that's kind of happening in this work as well. And I just thought it was this incredible to have the perspective of the sister telling herself things that maybe the reader disagrees with, as the sister keeps telling herself, oh, I know, she thinks that the clues that are coming back about her disappearance, she thinks are good signs. And you did something really incredible there with that first story, so I wanted to say that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So these stories are all really, what struck me about them was how different they were. We go into many different perspectives and kind of scenarios and people's lives. And what I found really incredible about this one story where it's about dating, I guess is the way to talk about it. And this is similar, this kind of phenomenon that happens that you write about is probably, I've seen it in the Philippines, where there's a matchmaking or a pen pal service, and you'll have somebody from the US or Australia or someplace like that meet a woman, and then from the Philippines or Colombia, and then they have a relationship. And I was curious about that story. I thought you did such an amazing job looking at the different people involved and the different perspectives. And one thing that I thought was masterful was there were characters that I just didn't like. And I just thought, I don't like this character. And yet by the end of the story, I was crying for that character and what he was going through. It was incredible. So would you talk a little bit about that story?
I think you're talking about the Book of Saints?
Yes, that's it.
Okay. Yeah, so the Book of Saints is actually told in the two voices of the man and woman in this relationship, and it kind of fills in the gaps of what one is saying and what the other one is leaving out at different points. And you follow them over the trajectory of their meeting. So they meet through one of those international dating services, right, that you mentioned. And they both have different reasons, different motives for, looking for a relationship in this way. Fundamentally, both are trying to escape different aspects of their life, right? So they're not totally honest about their motives and why they're in this kind of circumstance, but there they are. So they meet and they marry, and so you follow them over many, many years from that meeting point to this very kind of strange and problematic and not at all promising or kind of arranged marriage. And I don't want to give too much away. I'm afraid that I will if I say much more. But you see that they both undergo substantial changes, and there are shifts and things that are not at all obvious and rather quiet. And so that's what I was interested in. I was interested in those subtleties. And like you said, it doesn't go where you think it will. For some reason, that's the story that a lot of men keep telling me that they really connect to.
Maybe it's the compassion and
Yeah.
fullness
Yeah.
in which you present him.
That's what, yeah.
It's like you stay with those characters long enough to see them change. In a short story, I mean, usually in novels, people, of course we see it in short stories too, but you stay with them a long time.
Yeah, it's a story that explores, of course, the obvious homesickness that this woman feels in leaving her family to embark on the new life as a wife, but it also talks about that, how you go from being a girlfriend to a fiance, to a wife, to a mother, to then a longtime partner, and you're taking care of each other over the long term, and how all that, in a sense, is re-beginning your life in different ways at different times with the same person.
Yeah. Sometimes people will talk about how reading is good for us. It will foster empathy. What about for you as a writer in writing all these different characters?
What does it do for me?
Yeah.
I think I write because I suffer from acute empathy. And that's a way for me to maybe process it. Sometimes I just feel too much all the time, and I think all artists do, and that's why we, come to whatever our medium is to create and make something of all that. Sometimes I come just because I have questions, or there's things that I want to explore or understand, and I don't necessarily come up with answers in the writing process. But certainly, empathy is just a small part of it. What I want to do is open up windows to lives, communities, people, families, experiences that not even I know, intimately. And certainly in that work, I hope to be able to offer to a reader who's coming, offering their time to the experience of reading the story.
Do you get your ideas for these characters from the newspaper or movies, or where do they come from?
Oh, they come from all directions at all times, sometimes in very, very subtle ways. And sometimes it takes years for them to really come to the surface of my unconscious, I should say. I mentioned where the story Aida came from. There's another story in here, just to give you an example, called Ramiro, which is set in Colombia. And something that happens in the story is that there's a stolen chalice, the chalices that they have in churches where they do the communion and all that. And I was writing this other story, but that whole thing, that event actually came from something that happened locally where I live, where the golden chalice of a church was stolen. And I thought about that. Who would do that? Who would steal that, right? Somebody would, and they would probably in their mind have very good reasons for doing that. So I just started to think about that, because fundamentally in writing, we always think about what characters' motivations are. And when things happen that have, you can't really understand why they happen, well, I always try to think about the why, the motivations. Everything happens because it's fueled by desire of some kind, often it's misguided desire. but all motivation comes from some point of desire, whether it's the motivation to get out of bed in the morning, or it's the motivation to commit a crime, or embark on a new relationship, or move to a new place. Everything comes from that, seed of desire.
So, as you said, some time passed between publishing some of these and putting it in the collection. I wondered if there was any of the stories that you revisited and changed in that interim.
That's a good question. I have to say no, not really, because in the process of publishing each of those, they went through a lot of editing already. So when they were published, and some of them were published in publications, they really had gone through a lot of work before they got to that point. The last remaining story to be published, and it was the last one written in this collection, was the story Libellula, which was just published recently in Oprah Daily online. That story went through several really hard and intense revisions before it was published, and maybe that's why it was the last.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering, like, if I'd heard this before from some people when they publish their stories in a book, they'll like rethink it later on. But yeah, that's great. That's good. One of the other stories that I was really drawn to was about a writer, Vlad, in Campo Amor. And there's such funny, the book is really dramatic and full of action, but also it's like a really funny book too, like a good sense of humor throughout. And so there's these scenes with Vlad and his girlfriend Natasha where he's trying to be a writer, but maybe he's not really writing, but he sort of looks like he's writing, and then she calls him on it. And I just thought those were so funny. And I just wondered about that, and if that was something that you had seen, inspired by real life.
Don't we all know writers who don't write?
Yes.
I didn't have to go far to invent that. So that's a story that's set in Cuba. And that there are 3 stories set in Cuba in this collection that really all were born out of the years that I was researching my novel, The Veins of the Ocean, which is partially set in Cuba. So I was traveling there. I went there 10 or 12 times doing research there. So you can imagine it's a lot of trips, it's a lot of time over a couple of years. And I saw a lot and lived a lot there. That did not really make it into my novel, The Veins of the Ocean, in any way, but I still, really felt moved by a lot of inspiration there. So those 3 stories came out of that. One of them is Campo Amor. Campo Amor is an actual theater in Havana, this, very famous, once grand theater that is now in absolute ruins, as is a lot of Havana. And so you meet the narrator. His name is Vladimir, who's a Russian name, which is also not uncommon in Cuba. And his whole thing is he has everybody convinced that he's a writer, that he's a novelist, that he's working on a masterpiece, and he really hasn't written a word. And he's juggling relationships with 2 women, and ultimately he has to make the choice, faced with an offer that's very difficult to refuse, if he's going to leave Cuba or not.
Yeah, there's such great lines. She's asking him if he knows what work is, and he's going to defend himself. It's really funny. Definitely worth reading. I'm just curious about how you think of audience. Your work takes place in different countries and things, and how do you think about audience or the reader?
Yeah, that's a good question, and maybe I think about audience at different points in different ways. In the early stages of writing, I'm my audience. I'm my audience of one. Back to your first question, the solitude of writing, I think that's how we all begin as writers, and that's where I return when I'm in the actual process of writing. So I'm really not thinking beyond that. If I can keep myself entertained or convince myself of my own work being interesting, then I'm like, oh, okay, I can stick with it enough to complete a draft and enough to finish something. If I can't even convince myself, I'll just quit, right? And that happens. That happens a lot. Sometimes I can't even convince myself that what I'm writing is worth it, so I'll just stop. And then beyond that, as you start working more on something, well, then you start working on language and on the sentence level, and maybe thinking about working on the architecture of a story. And in a more interesting way. And then I think you kind of open yourself up more to audience, to the shared experience of being a writer with readers, right? I don't really think about it as like performing or delivering or satisfying an audience. I think about it more as like a conversation, and also if I'm allowing the story to fulfill its own potential. So I think if I do that, if I'm first in service to the story, allowing it to fulfill its potential, and then I'm also being honest with my own intentions as a writer, but I'm also being honest, and then I say, now it's ready for a reader. Now a reader can, enjoy it because I did my best. But I don't think about that early on until I really kind of feel like I've gotten there for myself.
So you're so prolific. You have, this is your 5th book, and would you be willing to talk about your process? And do you write every day? I mean, I know you're juggling a lot of other obligations as well, or work.
Thank you. It does not feel prolific at all. It feels very slow. No, it's just day by day, word by word. There's no mystery. There's no magic. Process. It depends. And it depends largely on what's going on in life. As you said, we all have responsibilities. We have jobs. We have obligations. We have family. We have relationships. We have lots of things. So in the old days, before I had less of that, it was easier to have those like writing dream days where you could write for like full stretches. That doesn't really happen anymore. So I just will write for a chunk of time wherever I can get it. An hour here, 2 hours here, maybe a couple hours a week, and sometimes that's the best I can do. There's no secret formula. There's nothing. It's just chipping away at it. And then in time when I either don't have the time to sit in front of the page and write, I take a lot of notes for myself on the side, so when I do have that time, I can return to it prepared, and not just sit there with, what am I going to do now, right? I try to avoid that by making plans for myself for my writing time, and that's it. Just try my best.
Thank you. So you teach as well. I was curious about, what do you see coming up? Like, is there, new trends or things that you're excited about with these next generations of students?
Yeah, I teach at the University of Miami, creative writing program. Trends, I don't know. I don't think you can ever see trends coming, right? It's only when they're here, you're like, oh, there you are, trend, right? So no, I don't see anything coming. What's interesting is the books that I guess were big when I did my MFA not so long ago are already like old news, like they haven't heard of them, so that's weird. But just shows you how ephemeral some books are, or how we come to hold certain books close to our hearts, and maybe the people who come after us as writers need different books, right? I don't know. I can't make any predictions about what's coming. But I think it's interesting because our world is changing so quickly, right? And it's always interesting to see how young artists, young creative thinkers are interpreting and transcribing that world in a creative form in new and vivid ways all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I know that from when I was coming up and doing my MFA program, it was difficult often to find Asian American writers. I would buy the one book that came out that year. I mean, it changed quickly, and now I definitely can't keep up. And that's great to have that many books. But you're working, in this kind of landscape, and I just wondered if it felt different over time during this time period of you publishing, if the response is.
Yeah, certainly, thankfully, the publishing industry is catching up a bit with reflecting what the true demographics of this country are. I don't think they're there. I think it's just a beginning, but it's certainly improved from what it was just a few years ago, right?
Yeah. So We can, if you want to, did you want to read?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll read from the beginning, from the story that you mentioned about the twin sisters. I'll read just a little bit from the very beginning there. I think you already know enough about it, so I'm going to have to set it up. So the story is called Aida. The detective wanted to know if Aida was the sort of girl who would run away from home. He'd asked to talk to me alone in the living room. My parents stood around the kitchen with the lady cop and the other detective, an old man who looked to be on his last days of the job. I sat in the middle of the sofa, my thighs parting the cushions. The detective sat on the armchair our mother recently had reupholstered with a fleur-de-lis print because the cat had clawed through the previous paisley. The old man detective was telling my parents Aida would walk through that front door any minute now. She probably just got distracted, wandered off with some friends. Our mother wasn't crying yet, but she was close. He looked young to be a detective. He wore jeans with a flannel shirt under a tweed blazer, even though it was August. He wanted to know if Aida ever talked about leaving, like she had plans beyond this place, something else waiting for her somewhere. I shook my head. I didn't tell him that since we were 11, Aida and I kept a shoebox in the back of our closet under some long-forgotten stuffed animals that we called our runaway fund. The first year or two, we added every extra dollar we came across, and when our piles of bills became thick and messy, we took them to the bank and traded them for 20s. We planned to run away and join a group of travelers, sleep under bridges beside other refugee kids and form orphan families like you see in movies and Friday night TV specials. Those were the days before we understood how much our parents needed us. Aida insisted on taking the cat with us. Andromeda was fat but could fit in her backpack. Aida had lied to our parents and said she found the cat alone one day by the river behind the soccer field, but she'd really bought her at the pet shop with some of our runaway savings. I didn't mind. The cat always loved her more than me, though. Did she have a boyfriend? Somebody special? She didn't. Neither did I. Our parents told us boys were a big waste of time and we kept busy with other things. School, sports, jobs, painting classes for Aida and piano lessons for me. Our parents said just because we were girls who lived in a small town didn't mean we had to be small town girls. Did she have any secrets? Not from me. Even twins keep secrets from each other. He made me tell him all over again what happened, even though I'd gone through it several times in the kitchen while the old man detective took notes and the lady cop leaned against the refrigerator, arms folded across her blockish breast. The young detective said he'd keep whatever I told him in the strictest confidence. If there's something you left out because your parents weren't around, now is the time to tell me. There's nothing, I said, and repeated all I'd already told them. How Aida was coming off her summer job as a gift wrapper at the children's department store at the bottom of Elm Avenue while I was sweeping and cleaning the counters before closing at the coffee shop on the top end where I worked the pastry case. We had this routine. Whoever finished her shift first would call to say they were on their way to the other, or we'd meet halfway at our designated third bench on the sidewalk in front of Memorial Park, and we'd walk home together. That night, a little after 7, Aida had called and said, "I'll come to you." When she didn't show up, I took my purse and walked across the intersection to the park. I sat on our bench for a few minutes before walking the park periphery to see if maybe she'd run into some kids from school. Aida was friendly with everyone, even the dropouts. Most everyone in town avoided, though they hung around the bus station and liquor store, and you couldn't walk through the park without getting a whiff of their weed. Aida had a smile for everyone. People liked her. Sometimes I got the impression they just tolerated me because we were a package deal. I called her phone, but she didn't answer. Then I tried our parents to see if they'd heard from her. It started from there, the calling around. Probably for the first time ever, the town employed an emergency phone chain where each person is assigned 5 others to call to see if anyone had seen Aida. Around here, you can't get a haircut without it being blasted over the gossip wires, but nobody knew where she was. This is a town where nothing terrible ever happens. There are perverts and creeps like anywhere else, but never an abduction or a murder. The worst violent crime this town ever saw, beyond an occasional housewife wandering the supermarket with a broken nose or a split lip, was back in 1979, when one sophomore girl stabbed another with a pencil in the high school cafeteria. The old man detective reminded us we had the good fortune of living in one of the safest towns on the East Coast. This isn't some third world country, he told our mother. The likelihood that your daughter was kidnapped is extremely remote. He told our parents it was common for teenagers to test boundaries. If only he had $1 for every time a parent called looking for a kid who it turned out had just taken off to a rock concert at the Meadowlands or hopped in a car with some friends and headed down the shore. And it had only been 4 hours, he emphasized. Aida couldn't have gotten very far. Our mother argued that 4 hours could take her to Boston, to Washington, D.C., so far into Pennsylvania that she might as well be in another country. 4 hours is enough to disappear into New York City, her dark, pretty face bleeding into millions of others. But the detective insisted, 4 hours is nothing, ma'am. You'll see. You'll see. Our mother and father arrived late to parenthood. Our mother was a spoiled Colombian diplomat's daughter who spent her childhood in Egypt, India, Japan, and Italy. She never went to university but was a dinner party scholar, a favorite guest, and indulged her international friendships for 2 decades of prolonged escapades in Buenos Aires, Los Angeles, London, Marrakesh, and Barcelona. She had many boyfriends, was engaged 3 or 4 times, but never married. She was a painter for a while, then a photographer, an antiques dealer. She sometimes worked in boutiques or found a man to support her, though she never wanted to be tied down. She was 38 when she met our father in a Heathrow airport bar. He was a shy history professor from Marseille who had written 3 books on the Maranos of the 16th century. She thought he was boring and lonely, yet stable, tender, and adulating, everything she needed at that particular moment in her life. They married and tried to have a baby immediately, but our mother had several disappointments until she received the good news of twin girls at the age of 44. We were born during our father's sabbatical year in Cordoba. Our mother said those prior broken seeds had been Aida and me, but neither of us was ready for our debut. You were waiting for each other, she told us. You insisted on being born together. Our father never liked when she talked that way. He said she was going to make us think that we had no identity outside our little pair. Our mother insisted this was the beautiful part of twinship. We were bound to each other. We were more than sisters. We could feel each other's pain and longing, and this meant we would never be alone in our suffering. When Aida was sick, I would become sick soon after. Our father blamed it on practical things, like the fact that Aida and I shared a bedroom, a bathroom, and ate every meal together. Of course, we'd pass our germs around, be each other's great infector. But our mother said it was because we were one body split in 2. We once shared flesh and blood. Our hearts were once one meaty pulp. Our father would scold our mother for her mystical nonsense, and our mother would shoot back that he was always dismissing her. Just because she didn't have fancy degrees like he didn't make her an idiot. She'd cry, and it would turn into the song of the night, with our mother locking herself into the bathroom and our father calling through the door, "Don't be like that. I just want them to know that if anything should ever happen, they can live without each other." So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we can open it up for Q&A from the audience. Would anybody like to ask a question? Or if you have a comment?
It's so hard to ask a question after you're reading something so moving like that. But I did have a question earlier, which was just about like your craft. Are there certain elements of craft that you like fall back on as an artist that help guide you in what could potentially be an infinite sea of? You could write about anything. You could go anywhere. Are there elements of craft that anchor you in your process?
Thank you. It's a good question. You know, I think I just often go back to who I am as a reader and what I enjoy as a reader. As a reader, my tastes are that I love voices or books or stories that feel intimate, that feel vulnerable, that feel like there's some kind of emotional risk involved, right? That feel that you're on a journey of some kind, whether it's short or small or subtle or obvious, where ultimately you feel like what you just said moved, like, you know, something happened, something shifted within you through that experience of reading. That's where, like, how I am as a reader. I like intensity, you know, like I said, I'm kind of like, you know, I feel things, you know, deeply, and that's why I come to art of any kind, right? To feel moved, to feel like I have arrived somewhere beyond where I began. So I come back to who I am as a reader before anything, right? Like I was saying before, if I don't satisfy myself as a reader, really, what is the point? In terms of craft or like process, actual, you know, the technical stuff, I go back to my earliest writerly self, which is pen to paper, you know? Pen to paper, notebooks, like the ones you see all over the place, right? And I think that's where I start to return to channeling my earliest instincts about stories that, you know, kind of run through me in an ongoing basis just by virtue of, you know, the mind and body that I inhabit on this earth and in this life. I think we all just constantly are churning with stories, right? And then we, as writers, we cultivate habits with how to excise them and make them into something, right? That kind of alchemy. So that's what I do. I have the habits, right? I don't know if I'm answering you if that's really craft. That's more like habits and practices, right?
Well, I guess that's sort of the question is like, what are certain habits that help like guide your understanding of how to both develop a character, the arc of a story, and the amount of things that happen and the relationship to each other, and when is it enough? Are there certain like markers? Like, do you think about it in any practical way?
It's totally impractical, I'm sorry. It's honestly, I never even know if I'm getting it right until someone is like, hey, I liked it, you know? But I'm very like, you know, tunnel through it. I believe very much in just launching in the heart of a story. I don't like a slow setup. Like, yeah, these are just habits and practices and tastes. I like just, you know, going deep with intensity from the very start. I don't like to feel like time is wasted in a story. Again, that's just who I am as a reader too. I like a sense of momentum, progression, where every word feels essential. I'm always cautious when I wander into the territory of like rumination or philosophizing on the page, you know. Not to say that I don't like sentimentality, because I'm extremely sentimental, but I'm always coming up against the edge of it, because I think that's also like, you know, a place where you can waste time and avoid the truth of being a writer, of telling a story. If you kind of sit on sentimentality and expect that to do your storytelling for you. I think it always comes back to characters that are true to life, authentic, whether it be flawed, that you're allowing them to have their own agency on the page. You're not trying to like make them performative or symbolic of any kind of message or agenda that you're trying to push, and really kind of release yourself of your own authorial powers in order to allow your characters to claim their own space on the page.
I'm sure that's hard.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. That's really amazing. That's cool. Thank you.
Other folks?
You talked about the intense editing process the stories went through. When you're editing a story, who are you getting feedback from, and are you ever in a situation where you're feeling either defensive or protective of your story or the characters, or how does that work?
I go through a lot of editing on my own before I kind of like release it, you know, to other people's eyes. And then generally the editing happens under the guidance of an editor, a magazine editor, a journal editor, or a book editor or my agent. So it happens that I tend to really trust their eyes and their contributions to the story. Sometimes if I disagree, it'll just be a conversation. I have learned many books into my career to not react quickly, but really just sit with it and think about it. And I've never worked with an editor that says, change this, change this. Usually what they do is they ask questions, and then what that does is get my mind going, and I realize, oh, that didn't quite land how I wanted it to. It didn't have the effect that I wanted, and then so it's my work to do, to find a way to, make it have the effect that I wanted. So ultimately, it remains my story, and I don't, personalize it or get defensive in any way, because I think everyone is working for the greater good of making the story, like I said, fulfill its potential. So yeah, it's just a matter of taking a step back. Sometimes it's taking a long step back. It's giving it a substantial amount of time in order to see the story in a more objective way.
Is the order of the stories, did that kind of first come from you and then get edits? Was that ever tricky to kind of just make the right emotional and balance with pacing and things like that?
The order of the stories, well, it came from me. I came up with the order of the stories. There was a time when I had a slightly different order, and then I looked at it one day and I said, no, that's wrong. And I changed it with no logic that I could explain. It was purely intuitive. By then, imagine, I've been sitting with these stories for so many years. I kind of have an internal sense of how they come together as a puzzle. So it was purely intuitive, and that's how I delivered them to my editor, and she left it as it is.
I thought I saw someone's hand over here, if that's okay.
You've been writing the novels and also the short stories. Do you do one at a time? Do you immerse yourself in the novel and then take a break and do the short stories, or do you do them in tandem?
Yeah, generally speaking, I work on one thing at a time. So these 10 stories were written before, during, in the sense they were maybe in between revisions or edits of a novel, and then after, but not at the same time. Like I'm writing a novel one day and writing a story the next. I can't do that. I can really only hold one thing in my mind at a time. So there are years when I write no stories, because I'm in a book, right? I'm only thinking about a book. But then if I finish a draft, and the book is not finished, but I have finished a draft that I need to let sit for a while because maybe I'm expecting edits or I need to just give it a break, then I will maybe write a story. So it's always one thing is on the table at a time.
Can you talk about how your experiences, not as a writer, but as a woman, as a human, might influence the fiction work that you do?
Yeah, I've only ever been a woman, so this is the only way that I see and experience the world. And the magic of writing is that you get to inhabit other lives. But of course, I'm only limited to one body, one mind, one brain, one pair of eyes, and everything is filtered through me. I love to center women in my stories. I find women, to be mysterious and powerful and fascinating, and so that's often something that I come to explore in my work. Not to say that's the only thing that I explore in my work, but certainly that sort of human experience is so vast and diverse unto itself. It's a world unto itself, and that's something that I'm only beginning to explore in my writing. That said, there are so many different ways to be a woman in the world, right? And I'm just writing a very, very, very small part of that kind of human experience. And generally speaking, the lives that I write are all part of the Latin American diaspora, which is, again, the only way that I have experienced the world. So I could not tell you specifically how, I have no specific answers for how it influences me other than it cannot not influence me, right? It's not only the way that I live life, it's the way that I am seen by the world, the way that I am perceived, right? I don't know if that answers you. Yeah.
Any other folks? Okay, well, thank you so much. We'll have signing, I think, over there or here. Not sure where. Oh, here.
Right here? Okay. Yeah.
Right up there. We have books for sale back here, and I want to say thank you so much. That was such a wonderful conversation about it.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out on this chilly night. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alex, and thank you for the story.